The Eternal Savage. Today we're talking about Edgar Rice Burroughs' The Eternal Savage. This edition from Ace was published in 1978. I actually have multiple copies of this book. Edgar Rice Burroughs was sort of the first author that I really started to collect, and so I have 3 copies of this book. I also have this Ace edition, and I have this old hardcover from Grosset and Dunlap, from 1925. It has this groovy J. Allen St. John illustration inside, which also would have been the same illustration on the dust jacket. I don't have the dust jacket. And this little ace has a nice title illustration by Roy G. Krenkel, who we'll talk about later. He also did the front cover. I don't think Edgar Rice Burroughs needs any introduction. If you're watching this channel, you probably are already familiar with his work. I was, as I said, a big fan of his when I was much younger. I might have been the youngest member of the Burroughs Bibliophiles back in around 1989. And I collected his books and read them voraciously. It was kind of nice. It was a family thing, too. My father had read ERB. My grandfather had read ERB. So I felt like it was a generational thing, too. Obviously, I read a whole lot of other authors these days, but every once in a while I'll pick up a Burroughs book and revisit the author, and that's what I did here with The Eternal Savage. It was originally published in 2 parts in All Story Weekly in 1914. The first part was called The Eternal Lover, and the second part was Sweetheart Primeval. And when it was originally published as a novel, it was The Eternal Lover. It wasn't until Ace reprinted it in the 60s and 70s that it became known as The Eternal Savage. I suppose that probably was a more attractive name for Burroughs readers at the time. Who wants to read about a lover when you can read about a savage? This is a sort of a time travel book and a reincarnation book and a prehistoric fiction book. The story is that there is this caveman named Nu, and he is hunting for a saber-toothed tiger so that he can present the head at the cave of his girlfriend and thereby prove that he is worthy of her hand in, I'm going to say marriage, although, they don't really talk about marriage in the caveman part. Matehood? We'll pretend that's a word today. While he goes out and he kills the saber-toothed tiger and chops off its head, but then there is an earthquake, and he suddenly wakes up in the 20th century. The landscape is completely different. The creatures are different. He kind of laughs at how much smaller the animals are in the 20th century compared to what he had to face, the cave bears and saber-toothed cats and cave lions of his era. And by sheer coincidence, he meets some people who are visiting Tarzan at his great big enormous ranch, an American couple. And he is utterly convinced that the sister of the brother and sister pair that's visiting Tarzan is his old girlfriend Nat-ul. And she has had dreams of this black-haired gargantuan savage who is going to win her heart. She gets kidnapped by some slavers, and he goes to save her. And then there is another earthquake, and that starts the second half of the book, which takes place all in the past, and he is returned to the past. And Nu and Nat-ul have various adventures, fighting other cave tribes and prehistoric creatures. I'll read an excerpt with one of those prehistoric creature encounters. This is when Nat-ul is, well, you'll find out. She gets attacked by a certain something something. Suddenly, from directly above her head came a loud flapping of great wings. A black shadow fell upon the sand about her. She glanced upward, and the sight that met her eyes froze her brave heart in terror. There, poised just above her, ready to strike with its mighty talons, hovered one of those huge flying reptiles that even in Nat-ul's day were practically extinct, a gigantic pterodactyl. The man behind her screamed a shout of warning. He launched his barbed spear for the great creature, catching it in the fatty portion of the long tail near the body. With a whistling scream of pain and rage, the hideous thing swooped down upon the girl beneath. Nat-ul felt the huge talons close upon her body. The heavy hide that covered her kept them from piercing through to her flesh as the pterodactyl rose swiftly, bearing her victim with her. For a moment Nat-ul had battled and struggled for freedom, but almost at once she had realized the futility of her pitiful efforts. In that awful clutch, even the cave bear or the bull boss would have been helpless. Now she hung inert and limp, waiting for the end. She could not even draw her stone knife, for one of the great talons had closed tightly over it where it rested in the cord that supported her loincloth. Below her she could see the tossing waters. The thing was bearing her far out from shore. The great wings flapped noisily above her. The long neck and the hideous head were stretched far forward as the creature flew in a straight line, high in the air. You can see that Burroughs is sort of unconcerned with paleontological accuracy, having pterosaurs and human beings interact. But, I don't think he was ever presuming to write something that a paleontologist would say, yeah, that's how it was. Something I find interesting is that not only is there this time travel of Nu coming to modern times and Nat-ul and going back to the past, and she dreams of the 20th century, and as she is, reincarnated through all those years, that there is this reincarnation thing. And Burroughs was not the only one to use reincarnation as sort of the means to get to telling the story of a prehistoric era. I'm sure some of you are familiar with Robert E. Howard's The Valley of the Worm. That involves a man remembering his previous life as a prehistoric person, battling critters and that fantastic worm at the end. Also, Jack London wrote a novel called The Star Rover, in which a man recalls the different lives that he has had, and the earliest of those is a caveman life. An author from the same area named Stanley Waterloo wrote a book called A Son of the Ages, which every chapter is a different era in which a life experiences a different time of development, Stone Age, and then Bronze Age, and Iron Age, and blah, 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 and has sort of prehistoric adventures in that book. So Burroughs wasn't the only one to use reincarnation as sort of the framework for telling one of these prehistoric tales. My son, who is 7, saw me reading this, and he asked me about the book, and he looked at the cover, and he said that has to be just about the coolest cover that there ever was. And it is a pretty cool cover. I don't know if it's the coolest cover ever, but he certainly seemed to think so. And I think the credit goes to Roy G. Krenkel, the cover artist, for making such a nifty cover that really does grab the viewer's attention. So I thought I'd spend a little bit of time talking about Krenkel and his life and his work. Roy G. Krenkel was born in the Bronx on July 11th, 1918. He was his parents' only child. He started reading Edgar Rice Burroughs during his adolescence and fell in love. He sometimes listed his three favorite authors as Burroughs, Robert E. Howard, and Talbot Mundy. On other days, he said Clark Ashton Smith and H.P. Lovecraft. Although the wild stories delighted young Krenkel, it was the illustrations in the pulps that really fired his imagination. At the age of 10, he considered himself, quote, a collector, and began a lifelong gathering of reproductions, prints, and books about art and illustration. He started down his own artistic path as a teen and studied under figure artist George Bridgman before being drafted to serve in World War II. Always the anti-authoritarian, he purposefully mucked up every job he was given. Eventually, he was sent to the Philippines, where he sketched the jungles. After the war, he used the GI Bill to attend art schools, namely Hogarth's Artist League and Cooper Union, but he said he didn't learn much from them. He sold his first illustration in the late 1940s, and shortly after that entered the world of comic books. It was in E.C.'s sci-fi comics where he started to make a name for himself. He drew these impeccably fine-lined cities and machines behind Frank Frazetta's and Al Williamson's heroes. He almost never drew an entire story himself. He preferred to share the work, not wanting to be rushed. He drew for other comic book companies, but his work with E.C. is what is most remembered. He'd later claim that he learned more about drawing while working with Frazetta and Williamson than he ever did in art school. He began to submit art to fanzines and science fiction pulps and garnered some attention. Donald Wollheim saw Krenkel's art in the fanzine Amra and asked him to do the covers for a planned series of Edgar Rice Burroughs paperbacks. Wollheim wanted an artist who might be able to evoke the same wonder that J. Allen St. John did for the original Burroughs hardcovers. Krenkel was a fan of St. John's work and accepted the job. He would paint more than 20 Burroughs covers for Ace. As a result, he won the 1963 Hugo Award for Best Professional Artist. Krenkel himself did not think that the covers were all that good, especially the early ones. But one job led to another, and soon Krenkel was doing covers for more than just Ace's ERB line. He was hired to do art for Daw, Canaveral, and Lancer. When Krenkel could not meet all of his Burroughs deadlines, he passed some of the work to his pal Frazetta and launched that artist's paperback cover career. Later, his work was collected into books and portfolios. His scenes from the ancient world straddle the line between historical and fantastical, but are always atmospheric and evocative. Despite the accolades and fancy portfolios, Krenkel saw himself as a mere doodler. There was nothing he enjoyed more than to sit with a piece of typing paper and a ballpoint pen and just draw whatever came to mind, be it prehistoric vistas, Bronze Age cityscapes, or Zapowie futuristic heroics. He did not draw to make money. It was pure pleasure for him. He sold his drawings for cheap and was just happy to see his work enjoyed by others. Month by month, he made just enough money to let him eat, draw, read something pulpy, and add to his collection. That collection of books and prints he'd started at the age of 10 ballooned into a gargantuan library. He couldn't stop himself. He once said, "I see that a new book has come out. I fall on the floor and foam at the mouth, one hand clutching the counter. I have to have it. Each book, portfolio, or print was an opportunity to learn something new about art making. They were objects of both admiration and inspiration. He did not buy originals, just reproductions. The pool of his favorite artists was deep and wide, but he had a special fondness for the pen and ink work of Franklin Booth, Norman Lindsay, Joseph Clement Call, and J. Allen St. John, as well as the detailed paintings of Munoz de Grain and Fortunino Matania. He'd pass his passions on to Frazetta and Williamson and any other artist who was willing to listen. Krenkel loved to chat about art and drawing, and what to admire about certain artists' styles. William Stout, Michael Kaluta, James Warhola, and many others were self-confessed Krenkel fans turned friends. Krenkel lived with his parents and never married. He worked in the living room, sitting on the couch with the cat on the table and the TV on, and the radio playing too if his father didn't mind. I don't like to work in the quiet, he said. I have to have people talking and things going on. I usually start about 9 in the morning, work till 10 at night, and watch both late shows, hit the pad, and start over in the morning. Later in life, he found television and even background music distracting and preferred silence. Krenkel was friendly, loving, and eager to share ideas and opinions. Al Williamson was quoted as saying that Krenkel was just one of the greatest guys I've ever known, one of the most honest, one of the most intelligent, incredible sense of humor. He was a wonderful guy. Krenkel died of cancer in February of 1983. He was 64 years old. So what did I think of The Eternal Savage? It had been a long time since I read it. I have very vague memories of reading it as a teenager, and I enjoyed it enough, but I know that I did not fall in love with it. Pellucidar and Barsoom and the more exotic, weird places, that's where Burroughs really captured me. But I thought that, it had been a few decades. Maybe it was time to reread the book. And how did it go down this time? I was pretty bored by it. Disappointed. It really lacked the imagination that his other books exhibit. I love At the Earth's Core. This concept of the hollow earth, which I know is not, he's not the originator of that idea, but this idea of the telepathic Rhamphorhynchuses that enslave and consume humanity. What a fantastic idea. I often find that the weirder Burroughs gets, the better it is. And this is really very much a very straightforward caveman adventure where the girlfriend gets kidnapped and he has to rescue her, and she gets kidnapped and he goes to rescue her, and then another girl falls in love with him, and his girlfriend sees that girl kissing him and gets jealous, and all these just sort of repetitive cliches, but without the sort of wild imagination. I thought there were a number of opportunities where Burroughs could do something fun with this. Here's Tarzan, sort of this archetypical savage, and he meets the eternal savage, and they really don't have a lot of interaction or parlay or anything like that. It's just sort of, oh, what a curiosity. It'd been fun to have them match talents, match skills, and that sort of thing. But Burroughs didn't do that. And I really feel like he could have done a lot more with the reincarnation kind of story of, as the 20th century woman goes back into Nat-ul's body halfway through the book, and she wakes from a dream of the 20th century, but then it kind of is forgotten. And wouldn't it have been interesting if Nat-ul could remember some of these things, or that even Nu, who went to the 20th century through that time-traveling earthquake and came back, and he could have talked about the strange technologies he had seen, or the curious people that he had met, but it's almost as if it's all forgotten. So I was disappointed. I kept thinking like, oh man, this is a great chance to do X, Y, Z, and Burroughs just clearly had no interest in that and wanted to just do a straightforward prehistoric adventure. So, and I'm going to say now the thing that really disappointed me the most, and that is the last chapter. So, spoilers ahead, and if you do not want to know how it ends, you might want to skip to the next section. But I'm going to say that the book ends with it all being a dream. And no cliché infuriates me more than it was all a dream. I hate any kind of story that ends with it was all a dream. It did not work in Invaders from Mars. Hated it there. I hated it in The Devil's Advocate. I can only think of 2 times where I think it works. One, it works in the movie The Wizard of Oz. I think that's fun. And maybe it's just because The Wizard of Oz is such an American icon that I'm willing to let that happen. And also, got to say, the last episode of Newhart, it works there too. That was a very clever, it was all a dream kind of story. But all those other ones where it just ends up being a dream, oh, it just, I feel like now I have wasted all this time investing in these characters, investing in their story, and none of it was of any consequence after all. Ugh. Ugh. Thanks for nothing, Eternal Savage. Thanks for nothing. Have you read Eternal Savage? Do you feel the same way? Or do you think it's a rip-roaring, fire-snorting adventure? How about Krenkel? Are you a fan of his work? I'm really quite fond of his stuff. And one of the treasures of my book collection is this. When I was in undergrad at Madison, I found this book at Cap City Comics, which was one of the finest comic book stores I've ever been to. And he had this book for sale, and I scrounged and saved up enough money to get this thing, which is just a collection of Krenkel's drawings. I would agree with him that here's some Conan for you Conan lovers. I would agree with Krenkel that his drawings are much stronger than his paintings, and this book is really evidence of that. These beautiful, beautiful illustrations. You know, like look at this lovely rhinoceros. So, thoughts on him? Thoughts on Burroughs? Thoughts on any of these things? Thoughts on that end cliche? You can write about it in the comments. But if you don't want to know how it ends, don't read all the comments. That's the Eternal Savage. Thanks for watching. I'm glad you joined me. I'll see you next time.